Everyone. Welcome back to class once again on Bible Survey 1 or Old Testament Survey. So let's move ahead and let's move into the next three books of the historical section. Okay, let me start sharing the screen. Okay, as you can see over here that this class will be on the three main, as we can see, historical books as we look at them. That is the books of Samuel, Book of Kings, and the Book of Chronicles. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's look at the introductory part of it. This is the second section of the historical books. The first section we saw uh, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, which was a part of the former prophets, as we said, and Ruth was a part of the writings. Okay, so this is a proper, we can say, the proper historical books according to the Greek and the English Bibles that we have. Okay, so this is the second part of the historical books that we are studying today. So they belong basically to the period of the monarchy. So this section has six books: First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and First and Second Chronicles. So originally Samuel and Kings were one book, okay, one huge scroll or one huge book, which was later on split into four sections or four parts when it was being translated into the LXX or the Septuagint or the Greek translation from the Hebrew version or the Hebrew scriptures. Okay, so why was it done? Because the Greek alphabet, the Hebrew alphabets, basically they used no spaces and no vowels in as such. But when it comes to the Greek writing or Greek script, we have to understand that it needs space, and it also has vowels and everything. We have to understand that it needs more space. So when it was being translated from the Hebrew scriptures into the Greek scriptures or into the Septuagint or LXX, it needed more space. So when this huge book of Samuel and Kings together, it was being translated into LXX or Septuagint, it needed space. So it was divided into four scrolls, which ended up to be called as First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings. Okay, Chronicles was different, and it is also basically counted among the writings. Okay, it is the last book of the Old Testament, not as it is placed in the Greek and the English Bibles that we see today. Okay, so it has a different approach, and it is completely a different book. Okay, now let us begin, and we'll first look into the book of Samuel, the historical book of Samuel. So these books, that we call it these books because it is one and two. So these books, this book of Samuel, basically, it forms a bridge between the period of Judges and the period of monarchy. So we see the time of the interim time of Judges, from the time of Judges up to the whole of monarchy that we see. So Judges, that is the last judge, that is Samuel we are talking about. So from the time of Samuel up to the whole of monarchy that the book of Samuel is talking about. Okay, so Samuel was the last of the great judges. Okay, he was the last of the great judges, and he was the first of the former prophets. So he's not among the writing prophets, but he is a former prophet. Okay? He does not have a prophetical book associated with him. That is why he is not called a writing prophet. He has written other books, but he does not have a prophetic book associated with his name. So Samuel was the last and the great judge and the first of the former prophets. Okay, he was an important leader, and we all know that he was a very important leader for the Israelites because he led them for many years to face powerfully against the Philistines. And then we also see that he was a person who installed and anointed the first kings in the Israelite community. So before monarchy, he was the one actually after Joshua. Before monarchy, he was the person who actually was uh, able to unite all the 12 tribes together, and they could fight for freedom. Okay, so that's what we can understand, that he was a very strong leader. He was a very strong judge. Other judges were actually leading tribe by tribe, but we see that Samuel was a person who was able to unite all the 12 tribes. So he was not the king, he was a prophet and the last judge. So he was leading the people politically, also, we can say, but he was not the king. Okay, because till that time, monarchy was not established. So, we see that he was a person who actually united all the 12 tribes towards the end of the period of Judges. So in Samuel, the author, we see that he not only records the history, but he also evaluates the rise and the fall of the monarchy, the rise of the monarchy basically, um, uh, both theologically and prophetically. So we told you in the last class also about the historical books, that it talks from a theological and prophetical perspective also. So the author of Samuel, he's not only recording the history, but he evaluates the rise of the monarchy, the monarchical period, both theologically and prophetically. So the author states that monarchy is instituted by God. Okay, we all know that, and we have been some of us have been under the misconception that it is not instituted by God. It was, but we have to understand that yes, it was a way of God's dealing. It was a way of God's ruling among the Israelites. Okay, so God doesn't go against the tide most of the time, but He uses the ways of the world to deal with the people. Okay, and to lead the people. So the author states that monarchy is instituted by God, but he also recognizes that the actions of each king may not match up to the ideal standards of God as a king. Okay? So, being human, so the kings were human beings and they were weak and they had a lot of weaknesses and flaws in them. So, though yes, monarchy was instituted by God, but we have to also understand that each king, being human, was unable to match the ideal standards of kings according to God. Okay, so all the Samuel's prophecies about the problems that would come when uh, when uh, when a king will start ruling the people of Israel came true with the rule of King Solomon onwards, as the monarchy becomes more despotic and more corrupt. Okay, from the reign of Solomon onwards, basically we see that there was a lot of corruption. Okay, and there was a lot of the kings wanted to become great people, and they tried to acquire a lot of kingdom and acquire horses and acquire men and slaves and women and everything. Okay, so from that period we see that all these things start happening. Okay, so but before that it was not bad, as to say, but from the time of Solomon onwards, this kind of uh, the corruption in the rulership or monarchy crept inside. Okay, so these books therefore give an important teaching and perspective about the Old Testament in general. Okay, let's look into the title. The title is Samuel, which we feel it's not suitable because the book is not only about Samuel, it is also about the history and the deeds of other people like Saul and David as well. Okay, so about the authorship, we can say that Talmud or the Jewish tradition, it supports the authorship that is accredited or ascribed to Samuel as a writer, but it seems unlikely that Samuel was the person who wrote all the chapters of the whole book of Samuel. The reason being that for the first 24 chapters, Samuel is alive. But as soon as we read chapter 1 of chapter 25 of First Samuel verse 1, we see that Samuel's death is mentioned over there. Okay, so it is possible that First Samuel was based on the book of the records of the Samuel the seer. Okay, so there was a book at that time which was floating, and there was a book that was read at that time, which is known as the records of Samuel the seer. Okay, so probably it was the base or the foundation according to which this book was written and completed, and it is mentioned in the First Chronicles chapter 29 verse 29, or it may be mentioned that the chronicler itself became First Samuel and the Second Samuel completely. Okay, as a whole book. Okay, so the author repeatedly uses a term or this phrase in this day. Sorry, to this day, to this day. So he often uses to this day, to this day, to this day, which means that they were written in a much later date. Okay, so they were written in a much later date. So it is a comparison, like it was happening at that time, and to this day it is happening. To this day it is happening. To this day it is so. So it is about. It is written. It can be said it was written much later about the time and the events that were recorded. Okay, so it appears that the author is in favor of David's kingship, strongly in the favor of David's kingship, and hopes to legitimize David's reign through his writing. Okay, so he's actually supporting, he's actually promoting, or he's actually legitimizing the David's rulership or David's reign through his writing, and it is very clear and very definite as we read the book of Samuel's, where it is so much about King David. Okay, so these two books were originally one scroll, okay, but they were broken down into two parts due to the length or the space required for the translation in the Septuagint language or Septuagint, sorry, Greek language. The division was retained by Jerome as he translated the Vulgate into the Latin language, and he worked. But he used the Hebrew scriptures or the Hebrew manuscript, but he continued with the structure of the Greek or the Septuagint. Okay, so now we can see that there are two main themes found in the book of Samuel. First is installation of monarchy. Okay, then the second one is the Davidic rule. So these are the two themes that are there: the installation of monarchy and the Davidic rule. So let's talk about these two themes little bit more in detail. Not too much in detail, but little more in detail. Okay, the first part is the installation of monarchy for fulfill so we can see that when God had a plan of salvation, he chose Abraham. Okay, he chose Abraham, he separated him from his family, and he used his family and him to form a nation, kind of a nation, as we can say. And he separated them, and he called them, and he made them holy, and probably he just invested in their lives, and he worked through them. Okay, so God's purpose. What was the God's purpose through it all? So from Abraham, we see there was again a lineage, and then we see these group of people also coming out. Group of people also coming out from them only. So these are the descendants of Abraham. So what was the purpose of God for them as a nation? Okay, so God's purpose for Israel was to be the means and the model of God's redemptive purpose. So God wanted to use Israel as a model for his redemptive purpose for the whole world, for the whole nations, all the nations. Okay. So God wanted them to be completely different. He wanted them to be set apart, completely different kind of a community with a God shaped ethical quality. Okay, the whole world was very immoral. People around, nations around were very immoral, and there was no ethical standards among them. So God wanted them to be, the Israelites, to be completely different community with a God shaped ethical quality, and they were to be committed to his ways. Okay, they were to be committed to his ways, founded on his righteousness. They had to be righteous people as their God was righteous, and they had to be just. Okay, they had to maintain justice, not like the other people. They did not have to be corrupt, but they had to be justice minded people, just minded people, and through whom God wanted to fulfill the redemptive purpose of for the world. Sorry. Okay, so this is how God wanted, or how God planned the Israelite community to be. He wanted them to be a God shaped ethical. They had to be, they should have ethical qualities like God has. They had to be committed to his ways. They had to be righteous and judge like the God is. And then through them, actually, God wanted to fulfill his purpose of redemption. That was the purpose of God for Israel as a community. That is why at Sinai, God gave them commands and laws and made a covenant with them. And with that covenant, God wanted to prove that all are equal. That all are equal. Okay, and the way he set the leadership, the way he set the pyramid of leadership was that the power rested with the people at the bottom, not with the king at the top. Okay, so if you see a pyramid, if you see a pyramid like this, you see this. This is the king because he is ruling. Okay, this is the part of the king who is ruling, and this is the base. Okay, this is the base part. Okay, so this is the people, and this is the king. Okay, so God never wanted this part to be heavy, but God wanted this part to be heavy. Okay, so we have to understand that God wanted the people to rule. the kingdom should be for the people, of the people, with the people, by the people. It should not be by a rule by one person. It should not be top heavy because it will become corrupt. That's what God always thought and always wanted. So that is how he used to rule. Okay, so the emphasis of the society should be on the social health and economic viability and of the people, of the lowest or the smallest strata of the society. Okay, what was the lowest and the smallest strata of the society? It was Bet that is the father's house. It is small units of houses. Okay, small units of houses or families, as we can say, which form the whole society. So the main emphasis of God was on the social health and the economic viability of the smallest unit, of the smallest, not only of the big units, but of the smallest unit of the society. And hence, they should not be, uh, hence, they should be socially decentralized. Means there should not be one king ruling over there, and there should not be hierarchy over there, but it should be for all the people equally. Okay, that's how God had planned and desired for the community to be. So all this was very different from other neighboring nations where it was top heavy, where the kings controlled everything. That's not how God wanted Israel to be. So the society was supposed to protect the weakest and the poorest and the threatened, and not for protecting the interest of the wealthy and land owning elite minority. So we have to understand that God did not want any kind of discrepancies or inequality among the people based on anything, not even racialism, not even sex, not even wealth, nothing. Okay, there should be no kind of inequality among the people. So God was always about protecting and supporting the rights of the weak, the poor, and the threatened. Okay, so not just to protect the interests of the wealthy and land owning people. Okay, so but we do not see this ideal situations running in the society of Israel. The turning point basically came at the time of installation of the king of Israel, which basically shifted the rulership from theocracy to monarchy. Now, theocracy is God's rule. Theo means God, and cracy means rule. So, theocracy means God's rule, where God is ruling. And now, when the people demanded for a king, when they approached Samuel and they demanded for a king, they actually wanted to shift, to have a shift in the way of rulership. So, they wanted monarchy rather than theocracy. Okay, so why did this shift actually occur? So there are two basic reasons why we can see it occurring. Okay, firstly, we can see that the sons of Samuel were not like Samuel. Okay, Samuel was getting old, and the sons of Samuel, who were actually helping him rule and helping him lead, the priests. Okay, so they were not like Samuel, and they were not leading with justice. So people were getting frustrated with his sons because they were not dealing with justice. Okay, so they, what happens, because they saw his sons like that, and they thought, now what will happen, now who's going to rule us? So after Samuel, are these his sons going to rule us? If they are ruling us, then they are not how they are supposed to be. They are not like Samuel, okay, whom we look up to. So the elders of the society, they go to Samuel and they demand for a king because they rejected Samuel's sons. They did not want them to become their ruler or leader after Samuel. Okay. The second thing was their desire to be like the other nations. Okay, so they also desired, or they also wanted to be like the other nations. So these are the two reasons, as we can see, why they demanded or they asked for ruler over them, or a king over them, or a monarchy. Okay, so thus we see that this led them to demand for a king or to choose a lower form of governance. Okay, theocracy is the highest form of governance, but we see that monarchy is a lower form of governance. So we can see that from a highest form of governance, they are coming to a lower form of governance by choosing monarchy. Okay, in doing this, they actually did not they did not reject Samuel, but they were rejecting God's rulership, okay, God Himself. So they forsook God. We can see in the history that they forsook God for other idols, and now they were forsaking God's rulership for human rule. Okay, earlier they rejected God for other gods and goddesses, but now they are rejecting God's rule for human rule. That's what is happening over here. So this has a twofold problem, as we can say. They rejected God as their king. Okay, first they rejected God as their king. Secondly, we see they reject their social distinctiveness with the desire to be like the other nations. So, by rejecting uh, God as the king, they wanted to be like other nations, and God never wanted them to be like other nations. He wanted them to be distinct and different from the other nations. So, by doing this, they were actually rejecting the social distinctiveness that God had planned for them, and they wanted to be like the other nations. So, though Samuel warned them of a lot of dangers and problems that they would face under the king, but they refused and they insisted, no, we want king over us. No, we want king over us. So finally, uh, Samuel decides, according as God willed, to install a king over them. So Israel soon had increasingly oppressing monarchy whose aim from Samuel or Solomon onwards was to increase their riches at the expense of the poor. So from that time, the became more poor and the rich were becoming more rich, and the kings and the elite class was gaining all their benefits at the expense of or exploitation of the poor. Okay, so the prophets continue to warn them of God's punishment, but because of the injustice they did not give heed, because their minds were corrupted and they just wanted to gain things and benefit for themselves. So there is injustice and no ethics in their minds. So because of that, we see that they did not give heed to the prophets also. Okay, and they failed in the sight of God. So Israel failed. Basically, the Israel failed to be an example to the other nations around, and instead became like them. So God had high plans for them. God wanted them to be model. God wanted them to be example for the other nations, but they fell from their position and instead they became like the other nations. Okay, the second theme that we see in this book is the Davidic rule. So the first king appointed was Saul, who according to human standards was good, tall, brave, powerful warrior. But he was a failure, and he did not, because he did not depend on God, but he depended upon his own resources. He did what he wanted. So he was a failure in the sight of God, and then God appoints David, whom he calls a man after his own heart. That's what is the author talks about him as, a God calls him a man after his own heart. Okay, the story of David's rise to kingship begins with the account of decimation of Saul's line. Okay, so Saul belonged to Benjamin. Okay, so we see that the line of Benjamin, in a way, we can see that it is cleared now. It is stopped. Okay, through in the kingship, because he did not obey God and he did not follow God in that way. And David's rise, that David's rise brought up Judah, okay, as the tribe, and with him, basically, we see that David's family also came in. Okay, so this basically we see that it ends with the rise of David's family and the fall of Saul's family and tribe. Okay, so David's reign consolidates the victory of Philistines. So what happens in David's reign? There is victory from the Philistines, and then there is unity or unite. He unites the 12 tribes. He establishes Jerusalem as the capital, and he brings the ark back to Jerusalem. And the last thing that we can see is that he prepares for the building of the temple. So these are the main highlights of David's rule. That is victory over the Philistines, and then the unity of the 12 tribes, and then we see the establishment of Jerusalem as the capital, and then we see bringing of the ark back to Jerusalem, and then we have the preparation for the building of the temple. So it is at this time that there was peace and prosperity throughout, and but it was interrupted with short phases of war and civil wars and attacks, and especially instigated by Absalom, his son. Davidic rule was always looked back as the golden age. It is always called the golden age of the Israel history, so Israel's monarchical history, and it is actually symbolic of the reign of the Messiah. Okay, and through his lineage only we know that Messiah also comes. So the Davidic covenant in Second Samuel verse 7, chapter 7 is a very important pivotal point of the book around which the whole book revolves. So it simply means till you follow if you follow God and his fulfill his covenants, your kingdom or your family will always be on the throne. Okay, so that's what the covenant God makes with David. in Second Samuel chapter 7. And it is a very important pivotal point, and every monarchy or every king has that promise. And every king, if till the time he is obedient to God, his family is on the throne. But when they become disobedient, it shifts. Okay, somebody else takes over. Okay, so let's that's about the book of Samuel, and let's look into the outline. First Samuel. First Samuel chapters 1 to 7, we see the final days of the judges. Then chapter 8 to 15, we have Saul's anointing and reign. Then chapter 16 to 31, we see that David's anointing and Saul's demise. Okay, then we have chapter Second Samuel, in which we have first four chapters, David's early reign over Judah. 5 to 10, we have David's successful reign over all Israel. 11 to 20, we have moral and political decline in David's household, and then in chapters 21 to 24, we have miscellaneous additions to this book of Samuel. Okay, this was the book of Samuel. Now we'll look into the book of Kings. Okay, Kings is different from Samuel in the way it is written. Okay, so these books record the reign of the kings of Judah and Israel from the installation of the first king up to the Babylonian captivity, that is in 587 BC. So it covers from the installation of the first king up to the time when Judah is captured by the Babylonians in 587 BC. So it covers 4 centuries, okay, 4 centuries of 400 years of Israel's history. It is the story, the writer sees a clear moral in it. He tries to find moral in the story of every king. Okay, so he sees God as the Lord of history. Okay, so he tries to show, the author of this book actually is trying to show that God is, God is involved in the history, and he's actively involved in the human affairs. That's what the author of Kings wants to show. Okay, so he's little differently portraying the history, presenting the history. Okay, so he tries to bring out God and his activity in the history of Israel and in human affairs. So the reign of each king is mentioned corresponding to the king of the other kingdom. So there is a comparison. Okay, the king of north was like this, and the king of south was like this. King of north is like this, king of south is like this. So that is how he keeps comparing. Okay, so the writer emphasized not only in the political acts of the king, but also how they followed God. Okay, so we have to understand that how they obeyed God, how they followed God, and that was a main criteria of evaluation of the author of the Kings. Okay, so the person who has written the book of Kings actually is evaluating each and every king on the basis not only of his political acts, but also on the basis of how he followed God and his commandments. Okay, and based on that he passes his judgment on those kings. Okay, so the history is interpreted in Deuteronomical terms. So this is a Deuteronomical history. This is not a plain history. This is a Deuteronomical history. So this is interpreted on the terms of Deuteronomy and covenant. So the kings fulfilling the covenant, or the kings following the laws that are mentioned in the Deuteronomy. That's how the writer is evaluating each king and writing about him. So accordingly, he says he's a wicked king, he is a good king, and all those things are mentioned in the book of Kings. So when the nation and its leaders submit and obey his laws, peace and prosperity will follow. If they do not, it's the opposite that will happen. So the political and economic disaster take over Israel and Judah as a consequence of the weakening of the nation's moral and religious state. So he says that when the nation became weak morally and religiously, there was economic disaster, or economic ruin took over Israel and Judah. Okay, there were attacks and people became they were looted and everything was happening at that time. So the book of First and Second Kings was originally one scroll, but in the time of Alexis, as we have already heard, that it became into four books. Kings and Samuel was divided into two books, four books, sorry, and it became one and two Samuel, one and two Kings. Authorship. So it is difficult to discern who is the author, but some link it to Ezra or some other later prophets. It is possible that it was composed during the time of exile, because the story is from the time of first king up to the time of Babylonian captivity. So some believe that it is a pre-exilic book. So there are various versions about the authorship. But traditionally we can say that it was credited to Ezra. So if we can see the message now, what the book. actually has for us, or the main message that we have in the book. So it states that if they reject the covenant and turn to idolatry, then God will destroy them. Okay, so it is simple and straight. You have to follow God and His covenant. If you turn to idolatry and you reject the covenant, then God will destroy you. That's what it is mentioned over here. So we can see that there are two extremely important characters in this book. We see the whole book of Kings. We see there are two important characters. That is, there are two important prophets. First is Prophet Elijah, and the second is Prophet Elisha, and their ministry is there, and they are dealing with a lot of instances and events in this book. And both are very different temperamentally, though they were the leader and disciple, but they are very different in their temperaments and in their styles. Let's talk about them, which become a very important two portions of this book. Okay, first we'll talk about Prophet Elijah. Elijah, he ministered during the reign of King Ahab, a very dangerous king, a very wicked and cruel king, from 874 BC to 852 BC. He belonged to the northern kingdom of Israel, and he was a fiery prophet. He was a fiery and dynamic prophet. He declares 3 years of drought to King Ahab for his sins, and then he suddenly disappears. Okay, then suddenly he comes back and confronts the priests of Baal and at Mount Carmel and defeats and executes them. Then he appoints kings of two nations, and then he challenges and condemns Ahab and Jezebel for the murder of Naboth. And then he appoints his successor Elisha and disappears into heaven in a whirlwind. Okay. Then Second Chronicles chapter 21 verses 12 to 15 records that he had a writing ministry also. So he also had writing ministry, and he also had books written, but it is not included in the Bible as we have today. Okay. Malachi chapter 4 verses 5 to 6. Prophet Malachi foresees him as the forerunner of the Messiah. Okay, forerunner, somebody who will come before the Messiah, and we associate him actually with the spirit of John the Baptizer. So his greatest privilege, as we can see, was to stand with the Son of God on the Mount of Transfiguration and speak with him about his coming death in chapter 17, verse 3 to 4 of Matthew, and Mark 9, verses 4 to 5, and Luke chapter 9, 30 to 33. We can see him as a type of John the Baptist or John the Baptizer. Second character that we have is Prophet Elisha. He is a very different person, very has a very different personality from Elijah. He has a longer span of ministry than Elijah and has a wider range of ministry also. So he ministered during the reigns of Joram or Jehoram, Jehu, Jehoahaz, and Joash or Jehoash. And then he started his ministry near Jericho and gradually moves to Bethel, where he is called to minister. And he had a prophetic school over there where he actually trained the sons of prophet for the prophetic ministry. He taught. He had the ministry of teaching. He healed. He healed people. Mainly, we know the story of Naaman's leprosy was healed. Then we see that he raised the dead, the Shunammite woman's son. He provided food. Okay, and he multiplied the loaves and grains. He also did a miracle in the nature, as we can see, floated the axe of water, iron axe of water. It should have drowned, but he floated it. Then we see that he healed the poisoned pot. And then we see that he saved the kingdom from being conquered also. So he was ministering in a lot of areas of Israel at that time. So, and then we see that even after his death, he is one person who has been doing miracles after his death also. So it is seen that when he was buried, okay, he died and he was buried, and a corpse was thrown into his grave in a hurry. A corpse was thrown into his grave, and when this man's body touches the bones of dead Elisha, this man jumps back to life. So his bones also, raise the dead from raise the dead to life. Okay, so he is also seen as a typology of Jesus Christ. So we can see John the Baptist as Elijah as a type of John the Baptist, and as a forerunner, and Elisha as Jesus Christ, the type of Jesus Christ, okay, in the Old Testament. Let's look into the outline of the book. First Kings, chapters 1 to 11, it has Solomon's reign. Second King, First Kings, chapter 12, verse 222, we have Davidic kingdom. Okay. Then we see that in Second Kings we have chapter 1 verse 1. Sorry, that was Saul's reign. Okay, chapter 1 verse 11 was Saul's reign. And chapter 12, verse 22 was Davidic kingdom. Okay, then we see chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 16, verse 20, Davidic kingdom. Again, it is continuing. 17:1 to 18:12, we see the fall of Samaria. Then 18:13 to 24:9, we see Judah alone. And then 24, verse 10 to 25, verse 30, the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, so that is the outline of the book as we see. Okay, finally, we enter into the third historical book, that is the survey of the Book of Chronicles. And let's look into this book also very quickly. First and Second Chronicles was also again one book. It was split into two parts at the time of Septuagint because of the lack of space in writing. Okay, the title of the book. The Hebrew title basically means the events of the day. It suggests that the scroll describes what was happening at every stage of Israel's history. So, what all was happening stage by stage. So, it was a mention of that chronologically. Okay, so in Greek, it basically means things omitted. So which means that the chronicler actually is has gathered or had records and facts of the events that were omitted probably by Samuel and Kings, the author of Samuel and Kings. The Vulgate actually followed the Greek title, uh, but Jerome suggested that these books, Jerome, who is the author of the Vulgate, we can say that in the Latin version, he suggested that the name should be the chronicle of the whole of the sacred history. Okay, that's what stated by Jerome. Okay, so a chronicle, basically, a chronicle is a record of events in the order in which they have happened. So it's a chronological record of events that are happening. So chronicle is something like that. So in English title, it is followed as Chronicles. So these books basically tell us the story or history of Israel from Adam up to the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, from Adam up to the fall of Jerusalem. The book of Kings was from the first king up to the Babylonian captivity, but we see that the book of Chronicles is from Adam up to the fall of Jerusalem, and it ends when Cyrus makes a proclamation that Jews can go back to Jerusalem and they should build temple. They should build temple, as Cyrus says. Okay, so the chronicler mentions a Saul's life very briefly and ignores all the faults or troubles of David. The third section, we can see that it recounts the activities of Solomon in building the temple, but he doesn't bother to speak much about the revolt. Okay, revolt that happened under Solomon and his son Rehoboam, and he does not bother to speak about that. He does not bother to give about details about the split of the kingdom. He does not talk about the split of the kingdom. He does not talk about all those things, and then after that he only mentions the northern kingdom as and when needed. So you have to assume that the split has taken place, and then northern kingdom is ignored. After that only he is focused on Judah. He's talking about Judah, and northern kingdom comes into the scene only as and when it is needed. Okay, so he is actually ignoring the northern kingdom for most of the time. Okay, so author, we can see that now author, why was author doing that? Okay, why was author doing that? Why was he actually ignoring the northern kingdom and writing about the southern kingdom most of the time? So he had a twin purpose. Okay, he has twin emphasis of writing the Book of Chronicles. So, and that is mainly about the book of the lineage of Judah, or the tribe of Judah, or the rule of Judah. So he emphasizes on the Davidic line and the temple. So these are the two main focuses, that is the Davidic line and the temple. He wants to focus on these two. That's why he is not focusing on the northern kingdom, because the temple and the Davidic rule is in Judah. That's his main focus. Okay. So his emphasis is that the people of Judah were the real and the true servants of Yahweh. That's what he believed, that the people of Judah were the true and real servants of Yahweh, and therefore he talks only about kings of the Davidic line and shows God's faithfulness to them, and he expands the godly kings, he expands on godly kings and actually limits the deeds of the evil kings. So when it comes, when the kings were not so good, or they were little evil or wicked in the southern kingdom, he will talk very small, very little about them. When the king was good and a godly king, he will expand on them and he will talk a lot about them, and then he'll also show how God has been faithful to them. So that's how the chronicler has been writing the Book of Chronicles. He also emphasizes on the building of the temple in Jerusalem. So he describes that in full swing. He describes that in detail, and he describes the role of David, how David made all the arrangements and preparations for the temple. He takes interest in the Levitical role in the history and the use of music in the worship. So that because he is interested into the worship, into the temple, something like that, and he emphasizes on the true worship of God, and he says that the true worship of God can only take place in the temple at Jerusalem and nowhere else. That's what the chronicler wants to say, that the true worship can only take place in the temple at Jerusalem, nowhere else. And he strongly condemns the worship at other locations, okay, at other high places, at the mountain tops or other places. And unlike Samuel and other kings, he is mentioning all these things. So he's so much, his mind is so much oriented towards Judah and the temples, and that is what he wants to write about. So he's actually talking about all these things only. That is why he's omitting the flaws. Much of the flaws he's omitting of the evil kings, and he's omitting the northern kingdom also, but he just brings them in if necessary. Okay, so just to remind you, the main focus or the main emphasis is only on two things, that is a Davidic lineage and the temple. So everything related to David's lineage and his deeds and his family, and everything related to the temple, his worship and everything, that's the main focus of the author, and the rest he is just sidelining, not giving much emphasis on that. Okay, so the writer uses all this actually as an introduction to the story of the building of the temple. So he forms this as a base because his main focus is the temple, building of the temple in Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple also in Jerusalem. Okay, and the reestablishment of worship community under Ezra and Nehemiah. Once again, when the temple was made, there was again a renewal of the worship, re-establishment of the worshiping community under Ezra and Nehemiah. So it provides a background also. Okay, it gives us a background as to why there was a conflict between the Jews and the Samaritans. Who were these Samaritans? It gives us a background also, that why there was a conflict between the Jews and the Samaritans, which reached its climax in the 400 BC when the Samaritans built a rival temple at Mount Gerizim. Okay, so there was a peak of conflict between the Jews and the Samaritans. We see where in 400 BC they built a temple in Mount Gerizim. If you remember John 4, when the woman at the well, Samaritan woman at the well, talks about the worshiping the temple at Mount Gerizim. Okay, so she says that you worship in Jerusalem and we worship in uh, Mount Gerizim. So that's the scene, that's the scenario over here, and that's a background that we get from the book of Chronicles. So it is widely accepted that Chronicles are linked. Chronicles, the book of Chronicles is actually linked with the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, because we see that the place where the book of Chronicles ends is a proclamation by King Cyrus to rebuild the temple, and we see that it is continued in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So it is assumed, or it is something widely accepted among all the scholars, that it's a continuation, it's linked. Okay, so the book of Chronicles is followed by the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's what we can see in the, even in the chronological order, and even if when you read, you will see a connection between all these three books. Okay, so authorship, let's look at the authorship, who wrote the book of Chronicles. Some scholars accept the ancient tradition of the Jews that Ezra has written the book, but the book doesn't have any claims as to the author. So in some places, it is said that it was written as late as 400 BC because of the given genealogy. But the writer probably used the information provided by the Samuel and the kings in compiling his work, probably. Okay. So this is what we see about the authorship. So again, there is no fixed thing that Ezra has written, but this is a probability that Ezra has written. Most probably, Ezra has written. So outline of the book, let's look into the outline of the book. First Chronicles, chapters 1 to 9, it talks about genealogies of the tribes of Israel. Then we have chapter 10, Saul's reign, chapters 11 to 29, David's reign. Then we have in Second Chronicles, chapter 1, verse 1 to 9:31, Solomon's reign. Then 1 to 36:13, Judah's reign. And then 36, chapter verse 14 to 23, chapter, it is captivity and release. Okay, so this is all that we see here in the books of historical books of Samuel and the Kings and Chronicles. I hope we also have to understand that these three books are not the same. Many times when we read these books, we read the first book and then we think that, "Arey, this is the second one. Samuel is just like Kings and Kings is just like Chronicles." Okay, that is why sometimes we ignore reading all the three books, but with this probably you would have understood the author's intended meaning or the author's focuses on or the author's emphasis. So it has been written differently with a different perspective, and there are major differences between all the three books. Okay, so it's wise and it's good that we read all the three books, Samuel and then Kings and then Chronicles also. Okay, so it is good to read all the three books, and we have when we read it, we will understand that there are differences. It's not a repetition, though sources are almost the same, but it is not a repetition. The focus or the emphasis or the authors are completely different. So author's intended meaning is always different in all the three books. So and it can give you a wide and a deeper understanding of the kingdom and how it served God's purpose to fulfill the redemption plan of God. So thank you and have a blessed time. Have a blessed time of studies. God bless you all.